Good evening, gentlemen. We are, with the help of God, beginning our study of chapter 8 of the second part of Tanya, the Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, the gate of unity and faith. We finished chapter 7. No, we don't need pages today. God willing, next week we'll have our pages for chapter 8. Today we are doing a introduction to chapter 8. Now, chapter 7, which we finished last week, we explained many things. Chapter 7 was very long, very involved. We had many classes on chapter 7, and it may have been difficult to follow the train of thought, follow what we were talking about. The good news is that chapter 8 is short and sweet. Chapter 8 is very, very nice, very enjoyable, and it's much, much, much shorter than chapter 7. So I think we will all enjoy chapter 8. It's like an after dinner mint for chapter 7, like a little dessert, something, ice cream. At the end of, in chapter 7, we explained many different things. Among the things we explained in chapter 7, and we explained how all of these things are really related, and all of these things are part of the core message that we learned in chapter 7 of this part of the Tanya. We learned, first of all, that the source of all the worlds is one with Hashem. Because until chapter 7, we had learned that the worlds are totally one with their source. The worlds are absolutely nothing. They're like a ray of the sun in the sun compared to their source in godliness, the divine speech which creates them. In chapter 8, we learned that this divine speech is totally one with God in its source. The source of the world is absolutely one with Him. And what that means is that the creation of the universe does not add anything to God, as counterintuitive as it sounds, as difficult as it is to comprehend. The creation of the universe does not change anything from God's perspective. He is Ani Havaya Le Shanisi. I, God, have not changed. Just as He was before the creation of the universe, so too He is now that the universe has been created. God hasn't changed. And we explained that this is true not just of Him, but of His knowledge as well. That not only has He Himself not changed, so to speak, at essence, but even His knowledge has not changed, which is extremely difficult. We spend many weeks struggling with this idea, hard to understand, because of course, how is His knowledge of the universe the same before it exists and after it exists? Very hard for a human mind to comprehend, but we explained that nevertheless, His knowledge also has not changed, because He and His knowledge are absolutely one. And so therefore, if He has not changed, His knowledge has not changed. Then we went further into a long discussion of the tzimtzum loy k'pshutai, the non-literal removal of God's light in Kabbalah, which we will not rehash and go into all of the details of that now, because you can't put it into a 15-minute review. But suffice it to say, what did we conclude? We concluded that God's infinite light, the Ore Ein Sof, His infinite presence, is even here in the world now, creating the world at every moment, and within everything in the world, God's infinite. We are within God's infinite light in this room right now, but we don't feel it, because His light is here on its own terms, not in terms of the world, and this is called Ur HaSevev, the surrounding or infinite light of Hashem. And then we said that, so then what are the things within the world, the things which have their own independent perspective, which perceive themselves to be a separate self from God, a separate being from the reality of Hashem? In other words, what are the things that the tzimtzum allows to arise, that the concealment of God's infinite presence allows to arise? These are nothing other than Mamale Kol Almin, the light of God which is within the world, which is the inner truth and the soul and the essence of each and every limited creation. And we finished our chapter by explaining that these two things are really one thing. The Ur HaSevev and the Ur HaMamale are really the same. God's infinite presence and His light which is within each and everything. These two things are really united. Right? And if you didn't follow any of that, that's okay. You can go back and review the previous classes. This was on one foot, a very, very quick just a listing of all the things that we spoke about in chapter 7. In chapter 8, it's not really vitally important for learning chapter 8 to know any of that, because the truth is that chapter 8 goes into a new topic. Chapter 8 is on something different. The truth is, of course, that it's not really totally unrelated, right? Obviously, the Alter Rebbe, because chapter 8 follows chapter 7, and as we've been going through the Tanya, we've been explaining how all of the parts and all of the chapters are related, and each one leads into the next. Right? It's a logical progression. The Alter Rebbe is, so to speak, teaching a course. The author of the Tanya is teaching us a lesson in the order that he's written it, one thing after the next. So there's a reason that chapter 8 follows chapter 7, which we're going to get into later. But nevertheless, at least on the surface, chapter 8 is really about something else. It's tangentially related. It's only related almost in a happenstantial way. And it happens to be that something that Alter Rebbe wants to talk about, we mentioned very briefly in the previous chapter. What did we mention in the previous chapter that the Alter Rebbe is going to spend chapter 8 and really chapter 9 as well talking about? He mentioned the idea that God and God's knowledge are one. This is an idea that is borrowed from Maimonides, from the Rambam. The Rambam says that he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. That he, his mind, and the thing his mind knows are all absolutely one. And this is a unity that no human mind can comprehend. We spoke about this in the previous chapter, the way that God and his own knowledge are one. Now, in chapter 8, the Alter Rebbe is going to expound on this idea. The Alter Rebbe is going to talk directly about this idea that Hashem and his knowledge are one.
I think we discussed it, that God does not lack any knowledge. That was the conclusion.
We explained that not only does he not lack any knowledge, but he knows in a totally different way than we know, right? He knows by knowing himself is one way that we put it. He doesn't know he doesn't need the external thing to know it, right? Which is how we end up concluding that his knowledge doesn't change whether the universe exists or doesn't exist, because he doesn't need the universe to exist to know it, right? Because his knowledge is inherently infinite. He knows everything automatically, right? Because his knowledge is one with him, so to speak. But now we're approaching it in a much deeper way. The Alter Rebbe is going to talk about this idea specifically. In the previous chapter, it was almost as a, so to speak, in passing, as part of what the Alter Rebbe was explaining there, which is how all of the universe, even in its source, is absolutely nothing in comparison to godliness, that the universe does not add to God one bit. Here, we are going to explain a different point. We're going to explain the idea that God is absolutely one and utterly simple. So again, there's really, in fact, these are two themes of the Shaar HaYichud V'Emunah, you could say. These are two aspects of this part of the Tanya. You have two themes in the second part of Tanya. One theme, which is what we've been dealing with directly for 7 chapters, is the idea, well, let's take a step back. The book is called Shaar HaYichud V'Emunah, the book of unity and faith. What do we mean by God's unity? Yichud, right? Same root as echad, one. Right? God's unity. Yachad is together, right? All coming together as one. So Shaar HaYichud, the gate of unity. What do we mean by God's unity? Now, there are different answers to this question in Judaism generally. In other words, the Alter Rebbe's answer to this question may not be the same, let's say, as the Rambam's answer. What do we mean by unity? There is a principle of the unity of God in Judaism. There is the existence of God, which is one thing, and there is the unity of God. What we mean when we say, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hashem is one, right? Fundamental the tenet of our faith. If you wanted to say, what is the motto of Judaism, right? What do we say? What's Judaism summed up in one line, in a few words? You would say the Shema. Hashem is one. Hashem echad. What do we mean, right? Now, there's different levels to it. There's different ways of understanding it. At the simplest level, Hashem echad means that there is only one God. Right? That we don't worship any other beings. Nothing else has power. Nothing else has any rulership or dominion in this universe. All power and all worship is to the one God. Right? This is monotheism. This is what Abraham introduced to the world. Right? This is the message of Judaism. There is only one God. And what's the hint that this is what it means? Because just after you have the first commandment, which is I am Hashem your God, what's the second commandment? You shall have no other gods before me, right? This is the fundamental Judaism. The first two commandments is there is a God and there are no other gods, right? One. However, once you begin to dissect this idea, you realize that the idea of Hashem's unity is not so simple. Because when you say that there is only one God, what you have to mean is that that one God is himself one. Again, when you say that God, when we say simply every day, twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, we say Hashem echad, God is one. The simplest understanding is that he is one and there are no others. When you go deeper and you have to ask, but what is God? What is this one God who is one and there are no others? You begin to get into what is God himself, the different traits of God himself. Because if God himself is not absolutely one in a self-contained way, then really you haven't said anything by saying that he's one, right? So let me give you an example. We'll start with the most physical and we'll work our way up, right? So if you say that a person is one, right? There's one Ronnie, everyone agrees. The universe couldn't survive two, right? There's only one, we couldn't have more than one. So there's only one, right? So we understand at the simplest level we mean there's one and there's no other, right? That's what we mean. But when you really get into it, if you want to say that Ronnie is one, and you start looking at Ronnie, all of a sudden you have issues, because he's clearly not one. There's a top half, there's a bottom half, there's a right side, there's a left side, there's an arm, there's a leg, there's a heart, there's a brain, right? There's a brain, I promise. Let's assume for argument's sake, there's a brain. So
something that I have to say, it bothers me. Yichud doesn't mean unity.
Right.
Yichud means unity. Yichud means beyuchad, special. It's a different. What you explain now is what yichud is, not ichud.
It could be any. I mean, I was looking at that. That's why looking at the book with whether it's spelled with one yud or two yuds. But nevertheless, it's all of the above. It's meyuchad.
But it's different things. Never mind. Sorry, I just had to.
In the title of this book, Yichud means unity. Okay. I can't speak for other Hebrews or other languages or other ways of using the words.
Yichud is special as well.
Echad yachid u'miyuchad. That's what he is, right?
It's the same root for all those words.
I'm glad we've figured it out. So, therefore, when we say that God is one, therefore, we must also mean that he himself is without parts. Because if you say that Ronnie is one, but Ronnie has a heart and an arm, and the heart is one color and has one purpose, and the arm is a different color and in a different location and with a different purpose and a different shape, right? How can you really say that he's one, right? And the truth is, that there's also a third meaning. There's a third meaning to unity. Because unity can also mean, yichud can also mean that God is all that exists, and nothing else apart from God exists. So you have three things. Number one, he's one and there's no other. Number two, he's one, and what I mean by he's one is that he is a single, simple, self-contained being with no parts and no divisions, right, which we'll get to in a moment. And there's a third thing, which is that nothing other than him exists. Nothing other than him exists. These three things in Judaism are all related. They're all really the same statement. They're the same thing. Right? Philosophically speaking, these 3 points, that he's one and there's no other, that he's one and he has no parts, and that he's one and that not only is there no other God, but there is no other existence at all outside of him, these 3 things are connected. Why? Why are these 3 things connected? So to understand this, we have to have a bit of philosophy. To go philosophy time. This is the introduction to chapter 8. We're going to have to look at the Rambam a little bit. If the Torah has a halachic obligation to know and believe, if there's an obligation in Jewish law to know and believe that there is a God, which is the first law in the Rambam's Book of Laws, by the way. In the Mishnah Torah of Maimonides, the Rambam's Comprehensive Guide to Jewish Law, the very first thing he says is that we are commanded to know, it is the foundation of all wisdom to know, is actually what he says, that there is a first existence. He's talking about God. If there is an obligation to know that there is a God, then we have to be able to define God. What is God? Right? I know many things. I know many things exist, right? The wallet and the watch and the cup on the table and the table exist. So what's God? If I can't answer the question of what God is, how do I know whether I have fulfilled my obligation to know and believe in God, right? And also all the other Torah obligations related to God, by the way, to love God, to fear God, right? To speak of God's unity, to say the Shema is also a mitzvah. Right? How do I know that all of these things refer to God and not to something else? How do I know I'm talking about God? Right? So in other words, the answer to the question, what is God, will tell me what God is that everything else isn't. Right? That's what identity is, right? That's when you're speaking about the essence of something. When you ask, what is it? What are you really asking? I'm asking, what traits does it have? What is its nature that distinguishes it from everything else, right? At the beginning of Maimonides, at the beginning of the Rambam's book, Mishnah Torah, and all of his laws, there's a whole list of qualities that God has. In other words, surprisingly, in a sense, there's actually many things you could say about God in which he's different than everything else, right? The first thing the Rambam says is that he is the first existence. There can only be one first, right? God is different than everything else because he's the first. The first. Everything else derives its existence from him. Everything else depends on him, and he depends on nothing else. Very distinctive. If I understand that about God, I know that I'm talking about God and nothing else, right?
First or primary? No, it's first and last. Together.
First is the same. What's the difference between first and primary?
Well, first implies that there was nothing before God.
Correct.
Where did God come from?
Correct.
No, he was there before.
Correct.
Couldn't have been.
Correct. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly what it implies. It implies that he's first. It means there's nothing before God, both temporally, in time, there's nothing before God. And also it implies causatively, which is really the main sense in which the Rambam means it, because it's a very long story. But in the Rambam's philosophy, when he says first, he doesn't mean first in time. He means first in cause. In other words, everything else is caused by God. And God is not caused by anything. God is uncaused. So the question of where does God come from, the answer is that if you understand what the word God means, the question is nonsensical, right? It's like saying, what makes a bachelor unmarried? It's like, what do you mean? A bachelor is unmarried by definition. That's what he is, right? Similarly, God, by definition, is that which has nothing before him. He causes everything, nothing causes him. That's what God is. When you say the word God, that's what you mean. Furthermore, the Rambam goes on, and he says other traits about Hashem, other things that distinguish Hashem from everything else. One of these traits is simplicity, pshitus in Hebrew, divine simplicity. The Rambam says it's a different way of saying that God is one. It's the second way. The first way is that he's one and there's no other gods, right? Which is really what I just said. So let me back. I'm teaching it all out of order. Pardon me. This is my fault. The first tenet of divine unity is that he is God and there are no other gods.
Can you say ADD?
The first trait of the divine unity is that there is one God and there are no other gods. This is the exact same thing as saying, how would you say such a thing philosophically? You would say that everything depends on him and he depends on nothing. Right? There are no other gods. In other words, what is more powerful? What stands above him? What else is there that is worthy to worship? Nothing. Right? Everything else derives its power and its strength from him. He derives his strength from nothing. Therefore, there are no other gods but him. Right? He is primary, the first. And there are no other firsts. Everything else derives from him. The truth is that there cannot be any other firsts, which we'll discuss in a moment. But there are no other firsts is the first point. Then we have a second tenet of divine unity. The second tenet of divine unity, l'chaim. The second tenet of divine unity is that God is absolutely simple. He doesn't have any parts. And the Rambam talks about this. He says that he's one. But he's not one in the way that a species is one or a body is one. A species is one, like all dogs have a certain unity, right? They're one species, or all human beings for that matter are one species. But a species has many members, right? There are many individuals which constitute a species. God is not one like that. There are not many individuals which constitute God, God forbid. And number two, God's unity is not like a body. A body is one, it's one individual, right? Like I was talking about Ronnie before, right? An embodied being. But the body has many parts, right? It doesn't have many individual members like a species does. A species is a group of many individuals all in one category, sharing one form, one essential nature. Like all dogs have fundamental similarities, right? But there are many different individual dogs. But then the Rambam goes further. He says, even in the individual dog, right, which you say, the individual dog seems to be much more one than the whole species. The whole species has millions of members. The individual dog, you can say, is really one thing. Right, in a sense, it's actually only one individual, one being. However, this one being itself has parts, right? It has paws, it has a tail, it has a nose, it has a heart, it has a stomach, right? There's a top side, a bottom side, a back, a front. God does not have a unity like a body either, like a single member of the species.
But
right?
otherwise, I mean, we know about the 13, what should I call it, way to describe it. The Chum, the Chanun, God doesn't have body, but he has other ways, I mean, to describe.
No.
Manifestation.
We're not talking about, that's not what we're talking about now. We're not talking about names or descriptions of Hashem. We'll get to that later. We're saying that God's unity is not like a body. Okay? So that's what the Rambam says.
God doesn't have a body.
Correct. God doesn't have a body. But we're not just saying that God doesn't have a body. We're saying that if he had a body, he wouldn't be God, is what we're saying. We're not just saying that he happens not to have a body. That's also true. We're saying that if he had a body, he wouldn't be God. Why? The Rambam explains, if he were to have a body, and by the way, we mean not just a physical body, but in a certain sense, a spiritual body as well, we mean, as we'll discuss in a moment. If he were to have a body in any sense, he would not be God. Because any body, or for him to have any parts, leads to a question of idol worship. It leads to a question of idolatry, which idolatry is the opposite of the unity of Hashem, right? Just as Hashem's oneness has 3 levels, so too idolatry has 3 levels. What was the first level of the unity of Hashem? That there's one God, no other gods. What's the first level of idolatry? That there are other gods, right? But then there's a deeper level. There's a deeper level, which is that when I say Hashem is one, I mean that he's absolutely simple. What's the idolatry? The idolatry is that he's not simple, that he has parts, right? So, why must God be simple? Why must God be simple? Why is it that if he's not simple, it leads to idolatry, right? God must be simple for the following reason. Given the first thing the Rambam says, which is that he is God and nothing else is God, right? Everything depends on him and he depends on nothing, right? Given that that is true, he must be simple. He must have no parts. Why? Because anything that has parts is only explicable, is only understandable in terms of something else. Anything that has parts is only understandable, is only given unity by something else. Let me give you an example.
All things are relative. That's what you're really saying. You can only define one thing only in terms of something else.
Very good. If the thing has parts, correct. So let's take the dog, for example, right? The dog has many parts, many different parts to its body. The dog has a certain unity, right? In other words, we understand that the parts are all parts of the same being, right? It's a unity. There is a certain unity among the parts, that they're all part of the same being. So here's the thing, though. The dog's legs and the dog's tail, for example, right, are different things. What makes them part of the same dog?
Connected to the same body.
Right, connected to the same body. But how do you know?
You cut the leg, he will bark from his mouth.
What's he?
The body is the
Oh,
dog.
you're saying the mouth.
Yeah.
You're saying the mouth will bark.
Yeah.
So there's a mouth that barks, which you're saying is
Shlomo once had a mishpat.
so you have a mouth that barks, and it barks or it cries because you cut off the leg, right? But the thing is that in the story of Shlomo, so you're saying in the story of Shlomo that the mother and the baby are the same being then?
No, there was a trial, a person with 2 heads, and he was
Yeah,
asking for double
I remember.
wheel.
Different story you're talking
So,
about.
I said, well, you're one unit, because, they pour hot water on one head, and the other one was shouting.
Yes, because they share pain, right?
Yeah.
They share pain. They have a nervous system that goes between them. But what connects the nervous system of the dog to the foot of the dog? The brain. But what connects the brain to the nervous system? No. Soon you start going around in circles. Soon you start going around in circles when you're talking about the part of the body parts of the animal. In other words, they're all connected because they're all connected. That's the explanation, right? They're all connected because they're all connected to one another. This cannot be, right? There needs to be an explanation of how all these things are connected, because if there isn't, you can't explain why these things are connected and other things aren't connected. Why should these things be connected to one another, right? So you explain that there's a higher order thing. You could say there is a thing called a dog itself, right? A dog itself, apart from any parts that the dog has, which explains the unity among all these things, right? As Ronnie says, you have a neshama, you have a soul, which in a very low and physicalized sense, this is what a soul is. A soul is the essence of the being, which defines it relative and including all of its parts and all of its aspects, right? The soul is the dog, the unified concept, which explains how all of these things go together, right? So therefore, there must be something as called a dog itself as a concept, which explains how all of these things go together. However, now you have a new problem. The new problem is that what connects the dog, the concept, to all the body parts that are in the dog, right? In other words, all you've really done is move the problem of explaining how these things came together one step back. First, I was trying to explain how all the physical parts come together. Now I explain that really there's a certain underlying, whatever you want to call it, a soul, a metaphysical unity to explain how all of these things are really one thing. But now that you have a metaphysical unity, that unity is itself defined in terms of the physical parts. In other words, if I ask you, what's a dog? You would tell me, well, it's this creature, it has 4 legs, right? And it wags its tail, and such is its behavior, right? In other words, the unity is itself defined in terms of the parts. So I need something which explains how this unity, how you get the unity from the parts or the parts from the unity. Am I making any sense? In other words, what explains how the concept of a dog, which seems to be one united thing, and this creature, which has many parts, right, are actually the same? We've moved the question up to a further place, right? So then you could say that there's a broader system which explains how these two things work together, right? You could explain that there's a world of souls, and each soul has a particular nature, and the nature is given a body which suits that nature, and all of these things come together and they fit together, the spiritual and the physical aspect of the creature, etc. You could explain a broader system, right? But every time you explain a broader system to encompass the unity of these parts, you create a further problem, which is, how do you now explain the unity of the broader system with the thing you're trying to explain by it, right? In other words, to put it very, very mathematically, really an oversimplification, but maybe it will help. To put two things together, you need a third intervening. If you have two things which are truly different one from the other, you need a third thing which connects them. You need a third thing which shares aspects with thing A and thing B, which connects them. The problem is that with every third thing, you now have a new two things, right? If A and B need C to connect them, then I have to explain why is C connected with A and why is C connected with B. Right? It's a whole new, because C is not A and it's not B. It's a new thing. So if C is not A, then I need a D to explain how C and A are connected. Right? You see, it's a continuing, it's what's called a regress, right? A vicious, an infinite regress. I just keep going down and down and down the ladder, right? Nothing should really be related to anything else. How does this whole process get started then? How can I say that anything is actually related to anything else if all these things are actually different, right? So there must be an initial thing which is totally simple, which has no parts, which includes no parts, right, is made up of no parts, has no parts, and is not the general species or general category explaining anything else, right? There has to be an initial self-contained thing, because anything which is not absolutely simple needs something else to explain it. This is very roughly the explanation. This is an old argument, this is an old it's actually brought as a proof for the existence of God. I don't know whether this proof is really eis gehalten, if this proof really holds up to what you would call a modern philosophical scrutiny as a proof. The word proof is very controversial and gets in people. It makes people irritated, so we won't talk about it. But the general idea that anything with parts needs an underlying unity to explain it, I think is eis gehalten. Makes sense to me anyway, right? Everything which is disparate, everything which has different parts needs to be explained as a unity. But that unity itself is not really a unity. That unity needs a further explanation and a higher unity, and so on and so on. The only way to end this series of explanations, right, the only way, there must be an ultimate thing which itself is not explained in terms of anything else, which means it has no parts. It has no parts. It has no multiple parts or multiple aspects, and that thing is called God.
Well, if it has no body, then it has no parts.
Huh?
If it has no body.
Generally speaking, yes, I agree. For a very broad definition of body, yes.
No, but the paradox is that if it has to be so simple that it can explain everything else.
Correct.
So it's very complicated.
Correct. Absolutely.
Simply mean monolithic.
No, by simple I mean non-complex. Without parts is what I mean by simple. But Ronnie is correct that really this leads you to a different problem, which is then how does everything else come from that one thing? Because that one thing can't be related to anything else because it has no parts. It's a separate issue. That's a different issue. That's not divine unity, that's divine creation. Separate issue.
So in Bereshit we talk about Ruach Elohim.
Yeah.
So does that mean like God is like energy? I mean, what is God? Because if it has no body and it talks about the wind, we describe God as Or and Sof. So how do you define it?
I'm not sure I follow.
No,
What's the
because
question
as well,
exactly?
the question is like God has no body.
Correct.
So this is like taken away. So he's not seen. I mean, he has no body, at least for us.
He certainly has no physical body. He also has no spiritual body either.
Right.
Yeah.
But we talk about Ruach Elohim.
Yeah.
So Ruach is...
So the question is, what's Ruach Elokim? It's a good question, right? The simplest answer to that question, by the way, the old philosophical answer, I wouldn't say it's Chassidus' answer, but the simplest answer to that question is that Ruach Elokim could be a creation. Ruach Elokim, yeah.
What do you mean creation?
Like a malach, like an angel. So Ruach Elokim, there's an angel which is called Ruach Elokim.
But angel has body. So.
I agree, it's not Elokim, it's something else, it's something he created. It's not Hashem.
Oh, so saying God sent like a messenger
Yeah.
in terms of an angel.
Absolutely.
Angel has a spiritual body, not
Absolutely.
necessarily physical.
Yeah, but it's not Hashem is the point. The point he's saying is it has a body, so it can't be Hashem. What I'm saying is that's exactly what I'm saying. It's not Hashem. It's a creation. I don't think that's what Chassidus would say, but that's the simplest answer to that question. It doesn't have to be Hashem, right? In fact, angels are also called Elokim elsewhere in Torah, right? The Ruach Elokim could be something he created to be merachefes al pnei hamayim. Yeah.
So, Malach Elohim.
Yeah, it's a malach called Ruach Elokim for whatever reason. That's its name.
No, but we said that God is like sending angels, and they are like called Elohim, so Malach Elohim. That's what you refer to?
No, we call them themselves Elokim, right? For example, similar to how we say Micha Mecha Be'elim Hashem, right? Same thing. We mean spiritual beings, right? Who is among you? Among all these, right? In other words, what I'm saying is there's many different ways to explain. Not necessarily does it have to be Hashem. It could be a creation of Hashem, right? Called Ruach Elokim. It's one way you could explain. Anyway, so Hashem must be absolutely simple. What I'm trying to show you by having this whole discussion, we're not really learning philosophy for philosophy's sake. And if we were, I would work harder to give a better explanation. Is the truth. We would spend a whole class just on this idea. But the main point I want to make is that when the Rambam says Hashem is absolutely simple, he means it's a result of, it's the same thing in different words as saying that he is the first cause, he is caused by nothing, and everything else is caused by him, right? Nothing makes him exist, he makes everything else exist. When we think of that in the simple language, we think of it in terms of creation or mechanistic cause, right? Like I'm causing this book to move across the table, right? Or a lightning strike causes something to catch on fire, right? So in that way, in the simplest understanding of what we mean by he's the first existence and everything else is brought into existence by him, right? We think of it in terms of creation, in terms of new things happening, of being pale, right? Of doing something. But the exact same lashon, right? The exact same language of the Rambam, saying that he is the first existence and everything else derives from him, right? It's the exact same thing when you're talking about unity, right? The unity of things. He is the first thing which is absolutely one, and all oneness, right? All unity in things is caused by him. No unity causes him because it can't by definition. He is the first in unity, just as he's the first in existence. Right? You understand what I'm saying? I'm drawing the parallel. It's the same thing. When the Rambam says Hashem is the first existence, it's the exact same thing as saying he is the first baseline simplicity which causes all other unity in things. Right? It's the same, it's really making the same point in different words. Right? That for anything else to be one unified thing, where must it ultimately come from? It must come from that thing which is absolutely simple, which has no parts. And I will let you know, by the way, that this argument applies spiritually as well as physically. Like I keep saying, the spiritual body as well. The Chassidus would tell you that even Orein Sof, even the infinite light of Hashem, is something that has parts. It has at least two parts. Why? Because it has the thing itself, and it has how it relates to its source. How it relates to the ma'ar, that which is giving off this light, the luminary. Even the infinite light of Hashem, which we normally say is absolutely simple, even that has two aspects. It has itself, and it has how it relates to its source. How do those two things come together? How can you have a thing and how it relates to its source in one thing? It can only be explained by a higher unity, which is Hashem himself. So even his infinite light is also parts. The only thing which is absolutely simple is Hashem himself, because he has no source. He has no source. Everything else that has a source has at least two aspects. It has itself and how it relates to its source. It as itself.
Even state, it's like how it relates to its source.
Why?
Because in that case, you're just taking away from the simplicity and the unity of one God.
Why?
Because if God is one,
Yeah.
that means he has no other part. He's like one.
No, he is, but his light does not. That's what I'm saying.
But, his light is part of him.
No,
So it's a
no,
part.
his light.
No, but it's
No,
part of his light.
it's his light is not part of him. You know why? Because he doesn't have any parts.
No, that's what I'm saying. When I say part, it's like a broken language to describe.
Yeah.
It's he is one, and everything that is connected to him is still him. It's like
There's a difference between his light and him himself. That's what I'm telling you. His light is still light. There's still something about it that makes it not him himself.
The same way you're talking about light, you can talk about his wisdom, his kindness. It's,
Absolutely.
it's
That's
expression.
one second. That's true. That's true. You're right. The essential point is absolutely correct. But then those things must not be him himself, it would seem. Right? He himself is absolutely simple. There cannot be different aspects, different
God and
yeah.
God wisdom are the same or separate items?
What I'm saying is that if they are the same, we have to explain it. In other words, if they are the same, it requires explanation, which is how the Rambam goes on to talk about God's wisdom. Right? That's why the Rambam begins to talk about how God and his wisdom are absolutely one. And he says it's beyond the human mind to comprehend. But maybe now we appreciate a little bit why it's beyond the human mind to comprehend. Right? How can something which is wisdom also be absolutely one with God? It is truly beyond comprehension, because when you understand what we mean by his absolute simplicity, right, there's no room for such a thing as wisdom, it would seem. Right? Wisdom is a defined thing. Then you would have him and his wisdom. That would be two things, you would think. Right? So the very idea that he and his wisdom are one, you're right, is incredibly difficult to understand, which is exactly what the Rambam says. But we're not at his wisdom yet, really, in the correct order of my explanation. We haven't got to his wisdom yet. We're still talking about the divine simplicity of God himself. That's all we're talking about. If it's not absolutely simple, it's not God. If it has any parts or aspects, even the parts that they have in his infinite light, it's not God himself.
You need to move on, otherwise you get two are not connected, then, what is God? He's not God anymore.
What do you mean?
They're connected.
What do you mean?
Of course they're connected.
Well, how they can...
If what two are not
say it's
connected?
simple and not. So
What?
If they're connected, then it's like
What's
the dot
they?
and the lid of
What
the
are you
dot.
talking about? What they?
Well, all the traits and whatever.
Like God and His light. I mean, it's like a...
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the Rambam talks about God's traits. He says he and his wisdom are absolutely one, but that's a separate point in the Rambam. In other words, that's something Eyal's bringing up. Once you have the divine simplicity, then when you get to the divine knowledge, you actually have a question. It's very hard to understand the divine knowledge. Very hard to understand how there could even be such a thing as the divine knowledge, which is something that the Rambam struggled with for many pages in Mor Nevuchim, and his conclusions are in Mishnah Torah, in his Halacha Sefer. In other words, not so. Obviously there are divine traits, but I'm trying to talk about divine simplicity. If we understand the divine simplicity, maybe that will let us appreciate what we're talking about, and to the extent we're talking about it when we get to the divine traits, which is really the preface to chapter 8. That's why we're talking about this, because as I told you, we're going to be talking about how God's knowledge and Him are one. But before you understand that, you have to understand this is Shaar HaYichud, right? The book of unity, the book of divine simplicity. So that's the second level of divine unity. The second way in which God is one. You have the first way is that He is God and there are no other gods. Simplest. The second way in which God is one is that He is absolutely simple. And we should see how the first way entails the second way. It implies the second way. It's really just the reasoning out of what's said in the first way. If He is the only God, if there are no other powers, if He is the first, He must also be that thing which is first, which is absolutely simple. That's the second point of divine unity. The third point of divine unity is that there is absolutely nothing that exists other than Him. And that is the point of divine unity we spoke about in chapter 7. In chapter 7, really as a conclusion of the first 6 chapters, really building up to chapter 7, so it's really chapters 1 through 7. But in chapter 7, we discussed how, even the source of the worlds have no existence outside of God. But we explained it, if you'll remember, as part of explaining that, we explained how Hashem's knowledge is absolutely one with Him. Right? How are the two things related? How are the two things related? Because His traits and His knowledge are absolutely one with Him, are part of the divine simplicity, that the creation of the world constitutes no addition to Him whatsoever. Right? Why is it that Ani Havai Eloi Shanisi, that I, God, have not changed? That the creation of the universe adds nothing to Him? It's only because He and His knowledge are one. If He and His knowledge were separate, then His knowledge could change. His knowledge would be different, right? His knowledge would grow from the creation of the universe. So the whole point that we're saying in chapter 7, which is the third point of divine unity, that there is nothing other than Hashem that really exists. There's nothing that exists apart from Him. Really, that third level was dependent on the second level. It was dependent on. In chapter 7, we only really said it in passing. We said it more briefly. But the third level of the unity of Hashem, right? That there's nothing else that exists apart from Him, is enabled by, it's only possible because how do we understand the divine knowledge? We understand the divine knowledge as being part of the divine simplicity. That God's knowledge of the universe is absolutely one with God Himself, who is absolutely simple. So now in chapter 8, with this preface, with this introduction of the 3 types of unity, what the Alter Rebbe is going to do is he is going to take a step back to the second level of divine unity. He's going to explain what it means exactly, or rather, why we can't understand is a more accurate description. Why we can't understand that Hashem's knowledge and His simplicity are absolutely one. In other words, the point to which Eyal was working. The idea that despite His divine simplicity, And despite the fact that there is a divine knowledge, the divine knowledge is not a contradiction to the divine simplicity, that he and his knowledge are absolutely and completely one and simple in the second sense. They are one and absolutely simple. So in order to understand the yichud of chapter 7, the unity of Hashem in chapter 7, where the world has no existence apart from God, we have to understand now a different type of yichud. We have to understand the absolute simplicity of God, the way that all of his traits, all of his midot, God's knowledge and all of that are absolutely united with him. And he is and he remains absolutely simple. So chapter 8 is going to move. We're actually moving in a way a step higher than chapter 7. In chapter 7, we were explaining the implications of the divine simplicity for the world, which is that the world has absolutely no separate existence from Hashem. Now, in chapter 8, we are going to discuss the divine simplicity itself.
But I have another problem.
Yeah.
We try to personalize God and to see God with his attributes as the way we define and we understand. What if there was another creature which doesn't understand kindness, doesn't understand wisdom? He has different ways to describe. Maybe under his categories, God would have parts.
What do you mean? Say again.
Other than human, we look at God from a human. What if somebody didn't?
Everything that describe God is like, human personalities, kindness, goodness.
Yeah.
So this is something we understand.
Right.
If you take another creature, which has completely different mathematics and completely different physics, he would come with his own definition, and maybe by his own definition, God would have different meaning.
There's 3 or 4 ways to answer your question. One of the ways to answer your question is that does any creature have their own physics?
Does any creature
have its own physics? Is there one physics, or does everyone have their own physics, for example?
Probably there are many. It's kind of I do not even know how to answer.
Some things, right, exactly. So I'm saying is there any indication that there's a different gravity that applies to different things? What do you mean you can't answer?
Are there aliens? Yes.
No, but that's not what I'm saying. It's completely speculatively, anything's true, right? Maybe there's a teapot orbiting Saturn,
you
right?
know what you know. You don't know what you don't know.
That's what I'm saying. But is there any indication that there are other ways of knowing in this sense? So that's no. You can tell me whether there's indications. You can't tell me whether there are.
I'm not aware of that.
No, there could always be things hiding from you, right? But sometimes something is hiding from you and it makes the bushes rustle, right? You can see the bushes are moving, so there's something hiding there. I'm asking you, are there any bushes rustling, is what I'm asking you.
Maybe I don't have the senses to watch even those bushes.
That's always possible, yes. And completely speculatively, yes, that's possible. But is there any reason to think it's so? You're telling me it's possible. I agree, anything's possible. Is there any reason to think that it's true? That's one answer to the question. A second answer to the question, which is really the more correct answer, will be the less annoying answer for you probably. The second answer to the question is that it really doesn't matter. There is no conception. There is no possible conception. Let's put it that way. There is no possible conception of traits, no matter what those traits may be, that would not be limited in the same way as the traits that we perceive. In other words, to put it slightly differently, you would have to propose not just a different creature, you would have to propose really a totally different reality.
Could be.
Right. Anything could be. In other words, you could not be sitting here right now, you could be dreaming all of this right now.
That's also an option.
So anything's an option. So how seriously do we take all these options, really, is my question.
Very seriously, but we are limited.
Do you take it very seriously? You take seriously the idea that you're not sitting here right now?
One thing that I know, that I'm limited with my ability
That's
to
correct.
understand things.
I agree.
So with my own limitation, I understand what I understand.
Correct. Absolutely.
So now with the simplicity.
In other words, what I'm saying is that that type of radical skepticism, you can't argue against that type of radical skepticism. There's nothing to say. In other words, it could be this, it could be that. You're right, anything could be. There's no argument against that. Anything could be. So it's really the same thing as saying that all that exists is what exists. I can only work off of what I have, right? There is no, in other words, how should I put it? If you had a totally different system of logic and it was anything else could be true, and you concluded that God had 5 heads and 3 mouths, sure, but that has no intersection with your reality whatsoever. How does that intersect with the reality of your world, right? It's totally not understandable. It's totally inexplicable. It's like saying 2 + 2 = 5, or that there's a color or there's another color, a new color. Right? Anything could be.
No, I'm saying even between us and the snake.
Yeah.
So the snake would look at the table and see something different than what we see.
But nothing so fine. So that's the bushes rustling. In other words, there's reasons to think that maybe the snake sees things differently. To answer that question, you would say the snake exists within the same laws of logic, exists within the same universe as we do, right? And underneath those laws of logic, it doesn't matter what colors the snake sees, all those colors would still be under the one God. There's no bushes that have rustled yet, and it's hard to conceive of how there could be any such bushes that rustle, that indicate that these philosophical truths are not true. In other words, they're not contingent on individual sense experiences, right? It's not that, for example, that when I look at the wallet, I perceive that it has parts. But theoretically, a snake could look at the wallet and it could perceive it as not having parts. So maybe the wallet could be God under the snake's conception, right? That's an easy problem to deal with. That's not an issue, because the truth is that the problem isn't really with the wallet. The problem is with the snake. If I ask the snake himself what he perceives, he would say, "I'm a snake that perceives a wallet." So you're telling me that the snake has 2 parts. There's a snake and there's the snake's perception. What unites the snake and the perception, right? And it works all the way up the chain. In other words, it's not dependent on Pashut. It doesn't break down to the human sense experience. It's a philosophical truth. It's a metaphysical truth. It's like 2 + 2 = 4, right? It holds. That's the level at which it holds. Right? Now, is it possible that there's some limit to our knowledge, and that in some realm of existence somehow 2 + 2 = 5? Anything's possible.
Let me give you another example.
Yeah, please.
So you put your wallet on a table and
Yeah.
tell me, look, this is the table, this is my wallet.
Yeah.
So obviously you can see it.
Yeah.
What if there is a creature that sees them exactly the same? It doesn't have any shades. Like for him, color is color and no color is no color.
Yeah.
Like 0 and 1.
Yeah.
And he looks at the table and says, table is table. I don't say there's no wallet on the table, because they all become one.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that could be different ways, to look at the same thing and get different conclusions.
Absolutely. I agree. But I don't think any of that affects anything that we said tonight. It's hard to imagine.
No, I agree, because we are looking and trying to interpret it and understand by our own understanding.
It's the only understanding there is.
I agree. That's a limitation. Yeah. Okay.
Just because, in other words, it's a competition between your mind and your imagination. Why should your imagination be better than your mind? Why should it be prior?
Because even my imagination is limited.
What?
Even my imagination is limited.
I agree. So even your imagination is limited, so maybe it's so limited that it can't see how the mind is actually more in touch with reality than your imagination. In other words, it's a sort of, to me it seems like a sort of broad skepticism, which then nothing is real. There's no basis for anything. We're saying, given the fact that you can reason, right, and that you are a human being, given the most basic facts, and that things exist, right, this is a conclusion that you would be led to.
Look
Please.
at a technician. He's coming with his toolbox.
Yeah.
And he's trying to open like a huge screw, but he's limited because his biggest plier can only hold that much.
Yes.
So he's saying, I cannot open it. It's like, it's beyond me.
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
So I feel this is the same thing, because at least I can speak for myself.
Yeah.
I'm limited with my understanding.
Yes.
And I'm trying to describe something which is by far like infinite time.
Yes.
Bigger than me.
That's absolutely true. I agree 100%. The Alter Rebbe himself is going to say in chapter 8 the human mind can't understand this. That's fine.
That's as
I
far
agree.
as this is the conclusion.
Yeah. That is the conclusion. But the thing is that you have to work to make your not understanding the best not understanding, right? You have to try to attempt to understand as much as possible, and then you can begin to understand what you don't understand, as we've said in this class many times before, right? You begin to appreciate what it is that you don't understand and how you don't understand it. But if your point is just that our mind is very limited and we don't understand God, I agree with you 100%. I agree with you. Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, the Alter Rebbe would say that everything that we know about God, we only know because God himself told us. Chassidus is not a philosophy that works from logic. In Chassidus, you don't find discussions like we had tonight. That's why it's not part of the chapter.
We understand, like a rabbi was trying to teach young kids,
Yeah.
not go with university language.
Nachon.
He speaks like a very simple language.
Nachon. He does, and then he also speaks in a much more complicated language as well, as the Torah. The Torah has many parts. Some are complicated, some are simple. But the bottom line is that everything that we know about Hashem, we really know because he told us. But the truth is that if you were really skeptical like Eyal, you would say, maybe we only think we know what Hashem told us because we're not a snake. Maybe if the snake saw the words of the Chumash, it would see that it's all the same and there would be nothing there to understand, right? Or if the snake was at Mount Sinai, it would perceive there was no God on Mount Sinai, right? All of these things are always possible. In other words, I'm just trying to separate the skepticism that you had, the total skepticism of what you were saying before from what you're saying now. There's a difference between anything could be true from anything could be possibly be true, right? There's a difference between saying that and saying there are some things I know to be true, but there are some things that I will never understand, right? There's a huge difference. Chassidus would say there are some things we know to be true. Maybe not through philosophy, maybe not through our reason. We know it because of revelation, because Hashem told us. But there are some things that we know to be true, right?
Yeah, in mathematics it's called definition by al derech hashlila, by the negative. We try to define things, but it's negative.
No, I'm saying even simpler than that. I'm saying there are things we know to be true, like Hashem spoke to us and gave us the Torah on Mount Sinai, for example, right? There are things that we know to be true. So a total skepticism could deny that. You could say, who says? Maybe it was all a hallucination at Mount Sinai.
This is something else.
I'm telling you that what you're saying is not so far, right?
People around telling there were no Holocaust. So I mean, okay,
Yeah.
you can say things, but
Yeah, mamash.
Okay.
So it's always possible. Anything's possible, right? Yeah. They could sit here and explain to you the whole night that it's possible that the whole thing was a conspiracy theory and blah blah blah, right? You could. So exactly. So there's a difference between that anything is possible, anything could be, and there are things about Hashem that we don't understand, and there are things that we do, and we are working to see where that line is with the b'derech hashlila, as you say, with the negative knowledge, with the knowing what we don't know, right? There's a big difference. Anyway, this was the introduction to chapter 8. Chapter 8 is going to discuss the divine unity and the divine simplicity, and we'll discuss it more, God willing, next week.